Hi, welcome to Keto Life Support, where we make your keto life sustainable, fun, and low stress. I'm Kim Howerton from theketonis.com, and I'll be coming to you weekly with some of my keto besties to bring you the practical, real-world keto advice that you need. Quick disclaimer, I am not a doctor, and even if we have a doctor in the house, he or she is not your doctor, and nothing on this show should be taken as medical advice. Always check with a trusted medical professional about your personal medical concerns. Hello and welcome to episode 19 of Keto Life Support. Just a quick intro from Kim Howerton here. That would be me. And I wanted to say today I'll be talking with a lovely Carrie Brown about how to make your foods a little thicker when you need to. Yeah, I know it seems like a really not exciting topic. And if you're not a cook, you're right. It is not exciting. But if you are, this is actually really helpful information. And I hope you enjoy. Just going to say it again. You'll hear me talk about this in the episode. I was operating on very little sleep when we recorded this. And the outcome is all of the words come out of my mouth totally wrong. Such as me repeatedly using the phrase, the dose is in the poison. No, Kim, the poison is in the dose. It doesn't make sense backwards. But I said it that way, and I'm embarrassed. But that is life, and the show must go on. And so I hope you enjoy this episode in which everything is upside down and backwards in my world. Okay, guys, enjoy. Bye. Hello and welcome to Keto Life Support. This is Kim Howerton, and I am joined by the delightful Carrie Brown.
Hello.
And we are coming to you today to talk about, I know, hold your excitement, people. Just hold your excitement. I know, it's going to be rough. Thickeners. Say it with me, people. Thickeners.
It's like my favorite topic.
All right. And
well, one of them.
Not like hair thickeners. That's Nisha. But food, right? We all cook. We like some things with different consistencies. How do we make them? How do we bend this liquid to our will?
It does seem to be one of the eternal problems with people who are attempting to convert regular recipes to keto is how do I make it thick with no wheat flour, no corn flour, no flour that is not made of grains. So it does seem to be one of the big thickeners and sweeteners.
Right. And so
the two-headed horseman of the keto cooking world.
Yeah. We just had Thanksgiving recently, and, people make gravy. That's a very good example of a liquid that people traditionally thicken with flour. And then a lot of people will say things like, this recipe starts with making a roux. Can I make a roux with almond flour?
No, you can't.
Roll.
Well, you can try, but you're going to be sad.
Well, my response generally is, how much do you like eating sand? Because that's what's going to happen. So a lot of cooking kind of starts with either making a roux. What's a roux, by the way? So if people are like, what the hell is a roux? It's butter and flour, right? But where do you use a roux?
So typically you would use a roux where you start by melting a fat, typically butter, and you stir in either wheat flour or corn starch, as you call it here. We call it corn flour in other parts of the world. And you kind of mix that together and you cook it until you get your sandy texture, which goes away. But so you make this, and that's the roux. It's the butter and the flour or the corn starch that you cook to burst all the starch, so that when you then add your liquid, which is typically milk, the starch swells in the liquid and makes it thick. And if you do it right, that sandy texture goes away and you get a beautiful silky sauce, like cheese sauce is the, mac and cheese sauce, right. Or, so that's what a roux is. But of course, because we're not dealing with wheat flours, or grain flours, that doesn't work. And the reason why your nut flours won't work is because they're not starches. So they don't, your almond flour, however much it's ground to look like regular flour, it's not a starch. So it's not going to burst and do its starchy thing because there's like almost no carbs in almond flour. It's basically a fat. So that's why if you're trying to make a roux with almond flour or coconut flour or any other nut flour, you're going to be sad.
You're basically making nut flour pate.
Yes, and it is definitely going to be sandy.
Yeah.
And it is also not going to thicken anything.
Right.
Well, it'll thicken it by virtue of the fact that you've added a solid to a liquid. So by physics says that the resultant mass will be thicker, but not because it's thickened.
Right. So when we say thickeners, we're talking about a substance that you add to a liquid to make that liquid less watery, right?
Or more viscous.
I was going to use the viscous word, but I was leaving it for you.
It's such a lovely word,
viscous.
It really is.
Yeah. So viscous means essentially thicker, right? More concentrated.
Yes.
No?
Yes. Well,
it's a texture thing, right?
Yes, it's a texture thing.
I should look up the definition. You know it when you see it. Viscosity. Actually, it was funny. I was listening to somebody who had a brain tumor the other day. Kim's aside for the moment. I'm
not sure how we went from cheese sauce to brain tumor, but carry on.
Her ability to swallow had been impacted by her surgery. Mm-hmm. Somehow, like the wiring that tells you how to swallow, essentially. So she had to relearn how to swallow. And apparently water is very hard to swallow for people that have had this happen. She had to add thickener to water.
Oh, to give it some grip.
To give it some grip and some gravity, because the water was not viscous enough that it could use sort of the pull of her throat position to help it go down. So I don't know, my memory got triggered on that.
Wow, that's actually quite fascinating.
Yeah, so
you would think it was the opposite. You'd think it was the opposite way around.
Yeah, I'm sure at a certain point, it's a bell curve. At a certain point, it gets too thick and then you have a problem again. But anyway, so in the keto world, what we're looking for in thickeners are things that will react with the liquid and become thicker without adding any significant carbs.
Right.
So there are a lot of people will say things like, oh, just use arrowroot starch, which is a paleo thickener, but it is actually very high in carbs. It actually
it is 100% starch.
Right. It's higher in carbs than wheat flour, actually.
Yeah, arrowroot is literally 100% starch, and tapioca starch and potato starch, and the name gives us a clue.
Right. Starch.
Yeah. So potato flour, tapioca flour, all of those things, starch or flour at the end, they are 100% carbohydrate.
Yeah. And so sometimes people will get a little freaked out, like, if you pick up a bottle of, my brain went blank, a bottle of this, there's a Primal Kitchens. There we go. Primal Kitchens salad dressing. Wow. You guys, I didn't sleep a lot last night, and like getting words right when you're really tired is bad news. So I apologize. Okay.
Yeah, so she's tired, not drunk.
I'm tired, not drunk, but they're very similar. So in me anyway. So I digress. So these salad dressing has a little bit of I think tapioca in it to slightly thicken it. But this is where you really want to start looking at the carbohydrate content overall. From my opinion on tapioca and maybe even arrowroot is they're not actually grains. The dose is in the poison. If the total carbs are still 1 gram for your entire serving, you're probably not getting a whole bunch of starch from that serving size. So they're in my probably not a good idea. I certainly won't keep them in my pantry, but there are some products that I'm like, I still think that's okay. Just an aside.
Keto is there is a lot of personal choice involved. If you've been doing keto for a while, you'll know that. And yes, you can use arrowroot. It works very well. It works particularly well for desserts, for making a glaze. It makes sauces incredibly glossy. So arrowroot is typically used in pastry making for the glazes and the finishes because it's super glossy and it's clear. And so, depending on all the usual questions, where you are in your journey, so on and so forth, if you want to use arrowroot, it's a personal choice. I personally don't, because I think it's just a slippery slope.
Right.
But it is a non-grain option. It comes from a bulb, basically. It comes from a plant bulb. So maybe if you're not hugely insulin resistant and you don't eat a lot per serving and you don't do it very often, then maybe that's fine for you.
Yeah, I would say, like I said, the dose is in the poison. I don't buy it. I don't have it in my house. It's just not worth it. It would sit there forever because the amount that I think is probably okay to use it in is so infinitesimally small.
Yep.
That it's just there are much better options. I just want to not be. It's a hard line, people. I don't want to be completely black and white, and I also want to be really clear. And so some of these fuzzy edges are challenging. There's good, goodish, and gooder.
So if for the black and white among you,
yeah,
don't use arrowroot.
Yeah, absolutely not.
And for the grayer people, then that might be a thing you want to look at.
Certainly don't bake with it, for God's sakes.
Yeah.
Like I cannot tell you the number of quote unquote keto bread recipes where people are like, this is amazing. And I'm like, yes, it's amazing because it's bread. It's
right.
It's
right. So
bread.
If you're talking about a recipe that has like half a teaspoon of arrowroot, have at it. But you'll see some of the baked goods recipes out there have half a cup of arrowroot or a whole cup of arrowroot, and it makes the best bread ever. Well, yes, it would, because it's basically just a different thing to wheat flour. So, yeah. So if it's talking about portions of teaspoons, then
a difference.
There may be instances where I would consider it, but if we're getting into tablespoons or cups, then absolutely not.
Right. So some other things that people will use as thickeners, though, chia seeds. Chia seeds
are actually really, really good. Well, actually, they do thicken, but they actually gel, which is slightly different. So you do get a bit of a different result, especially if it's very, very cold afterwards.
What's the difference between a thickener and a gel?
Well, a gel has.
I'm throwing the tough questions, people.
I'm not sure I know how to describe it.
I have a guess. Is it that a gel has to be cold to get thicker? Is that true or not?
Right, and so that's one of the things that's kind of confuses me, because a lot of folk bloggers out there will add gelatin and say it's a thickener, and I'm like, well, actually it's not a thickener, it's a gel, but also it only gels when it's cold. If you warm it up, it's going to be liquid again. So whereas a thickener will thicken at any temperature. Some require heat to get them there, but then they don't become anything different when they're cold. Whereas anything with gelatin in is going to be liquid when it's hot. Mm-hmm. Gelatin is only a gel when it's cold.
Right, which is why you use it in things like panna cotta.
Right. Or mousses or things like that. But I've seen quite a few blogger recipes where they say use gelatin as a thickener, and I'm like, no. If it's a hot thing, it's not going to thicken. It will only thicken when it's cold, and it's a hot dish, so you want to eat it when it's hot. Gelatin's not going to help you.
Right. So in general, we could define so in the broader scope, a thickener is something that if you add it to a liquid substance, the end result is thicker than it would be without it. So something like gelatin or chia might be used in a dish that's ultimately meant to be served cold. And in the loose statement, you can put a thickener for those.
Right. A thickener is thick at any temperature. A gel is only thick when it's cold, and it's kind of not even just thick. It almost becomes solid, depending on the ratio of gelatin to liquid. It could actually literally become a solid. So they are quite different. But if it's a hot dish and it's got gelatin in it, that kind of, no.
If it's a hot dish and it has gelatin in it, highly question the recipe creator.
Yes, move on. Yes.
They are not to be trusted.
Right.
Okay. So now I'm like, did I ever do? No. Okay. So let us.
Sometimes I hate saying this out loud, but on the other hand, I really want people to be successful in the kitchen. And it's incredibly frustrating when you find recipes on the internet that you assume work and taste good, and then you spend time and money and effort doing it, and then it's like, what? This tastes horrible, or it doesn't work, or why is it not thick? It says use gelatin and it's not thick. What's happening? So there it is.
Right.
Truth bomb right there.
That's right. Okay. So in general, though, the thickeners that people tend to ask about in terms of a hot liquid. So let's talk about gravy. That's the easiest example I can think of. So I thicken my gravy with glucomannan, aka konjac root powder. What do you do?
Absolutely. The konjac or glucomannan, either this is interchangeably known, is the hands down best thickener for all of your hot sauces, gravies, stews, soups, all of your hot things. Where you would have used cornstarch or wheat flour, absolutely konjac, hands down. Lots of reasons. It works better. I mean, it thickens better. You use a much smaller amount. It is 10 times has the thickening ability of 10 times that of cornstarch. So you use a tiny amount, but it also, when it does get cold, say you make soup and you only eat one portion, so you've got 3 portions left. One of the things that makes konjac flour the best keto thickener out there is that it reheats beautifully. It doesn't, when it gets cold, it doesn't leak. It doesn't separate out. When you reheat it, it looks exactly like you just made it. The same cannot be said for guar gum or xanthan gum, which are absolutely not the right thickeners to use for sauces, gravies, soups, stews, all of those things where we use cornstarch. It's just, do they work? Well, kind of. Are they the best? Not by a long shot. You absolutely need to get some konjac flour in your pantry for all of those things I've just mentioned.
Okay. So you mentioned xanthan gum. What is xanthan gum good for?
So xanthan gum, people get very confused between xanthan gum and guar gum. Xanthan gum should really only be used to add structure, to strength to baked goods. So it kind of helps to replace gluten. It doesn't replace gluten, but that's its superpower, is giving a more gluten-like structure to baked goods. So xanthan gum you would use in your baked goods. So your biscuits, your scones, your cakes, your waffles, to just give it to stop it being so crumbly, to stop it falling apart. It adds structure to baked goods. That's its superpower.
Because a lot of people use xanthan gum in liquids as a thickener. I see it quite often.
Right. Because blogger recipes.
Got it. And
sorry.
Yeah, I understand. Okay, so that would be a misapplication of xanthan gum.
Yeah, absolutely not the best thing to use. And why? So xanthan gum is not as good as at emulsifying. So you really, if you have a liquid that you're trying to thicken, you really want an emulsifier, not a structural thing. Xanthan gum is best for structure. If you use it to thicken sauces, one, it's incredibly difficult to get it in there without getting lumps. Because it just literally, you show it liquid and it thickens in heartbeat. That's another plus about konjac, is that it takes a couple of minutes to thicken. So you have time to get it in there without it, in a heartbeat turning into a thick, lumpy mess. So it's
an important thing to note, people, because if you put a little bit in and it doesn't get thick immediately, wait. Don't add more yet, or else you'll be that person that kept eating, because they thought they were hungry and they hadn't given their stomach time to catch up, and then you feel like you're going to die.
But when you get used to using konjac, you will realize how much easier it is to use than gums, which is the wrong thing anyway. But konjac is so much easier because you have time to get it in. You don't have this panic of like, it's going to go lumpy, because it takes a couple of minutes to actually get thick.
Right. And then there's another side to this, which is I'm incredibly stomach sensitive to most gums. Mm-hmm. My tummy does not like them at all.
Right.
And I'm not at all, I don't have any problem with konjac. It is a very stomach friendly. It's actually considered so here's the thing. A lot of these gums are actually prebiotics, which on some people will say are really helpful, but for other people, they cause horrendous gas and problems. But konjac is a really easily digestible starch. And it's not backing up.
It's insoluble fiber. So if you've ever had miracle noodles, or they are made of konjac. So the konjac flour is literally a powdered shirataki noodle.
Right. And actually, if you blend I've done this before. If you can throw miracle rice in your blender and it makes like a porridge, because it's this like really thick thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's where it comes from. So problems with xanthan gum, and you may be listening to this and recognize some of these symptoms, is that it makes things slimy. So if any of your things have come out slimy, it's the xanthan gum. It's particularly slimy with anything dairy. It's slimier with dairy than it is with, say, if you make a hot thing that has a stock base and you thicken it with xanthan, it'll be slimy. But if you're using a dairy base, super slimy. Cheese sauce, super slimy. So, and it also does not reheat well. So when I mentioned earlier, so you can't have leftovers because the xanthan either weeps, so it releases liquid when it gets cold, or it just doesn't reheat to the nice, smooth, lovely consistency you had the day before, because that's not what it's intended to do.
Okay, so pretty much if people need a thickener in their pantry for some of these kinds of things, if they just got konjac, would you feel like that they would be covered? So
if they're doing baking, xanthan gum is useful in giving you a stronger, a more sturdy, one of my favorite words. I had a sturdy cat once. My cheddar biscuits are often referred to as sturdy biscuits because they don't, fall apart when you look at them. In part, that's due to the fact that they have xanthan gum in. So if you do a lot of baking, xanthan gum is your friend for making your baked goods less fragile.
Okay.
Konjac for all your hot soups, sauces, stews, all of that kind of stuff where you would normally thicken with cornstarch or wheat flour. Then the other thing that I use, not as much as konjac, but the other thing I use is guar gum, which is completely different to xanthan gum, and people are very confused and they think they're interchangeable. Guar gum is much better used in cold applications, so ice creams or smoothies, and guar gum is actually magical in cold things. It will make your smoothie, if you like smoothies, or you've had smoothies before, you know that you make them and then you leave it for half an hour and it separates and all the liquid goes to the bottom and everything else doesn't. Guar gum will turn your smoothie or your shake into this magical, thick, like melted ice cream consistency. You can make your smoothie the night before, put it in the fridge, and it will still be perfect the next morning. So, and the reason for that is that the guar gum's superpower is emulsification, which is
emulsification.
Emulsification is it holds the water and the fat together. So normally water and fat are enemies and they separate. Guar gum holds the water molecules and the fat molecules together so that they don't separate. So you get this beautiful, smooth, emulsified, whatever it is you're trying to emulsify. Guar gum, I use guar gum in ice cream. It's brilliant in ice cream, better than xanthan gum. And it's best in cold applications. The other thing that it's good for is if you have something where you want something to stay in suspension, guar gum is magical at keeping things suspended. So, for example, if you have a mushroom soup which has bits of mushroom in and you don't want all the bits to sink, guar gum will magically keep all of the bits in suspension.
So in that instance, it would be in a hot application.
It would.
Okay.
But, so I don't use, I know that sounds contradictory, I use a small amount of guar gum and mainly konjac. Konjac for the thickening, the tiny amount of guar gum to hold everything in suspension. So with soups where I need to keep something in suspension, I will use both because they have different properties, if that made sense.
Right.
And the amount you use a lot less guar gum, because you have the same problem with guar gum as you do with xanthan gum, is that the texture isn't good. If you try and thicken something, if you try and replace cornstarch, guar gum, the texture's not right. It doesn't reheat well. It becomes slimy. If you have enough to thicken it, it will become slimy. And again, particularly when you use it with dairy products such as cream or cheese, it will be slimy and it's really quite nasty.
Yeah, so I'm very sensitive to that. If there's even a hint of that guar gum sliminess, I'm a no. I'm out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So those are the three I use. I use xanthan gum, guar gum, and konjac flour. They all have different purposes, and I use them for different things, and I use them for the appropriate application. As I said, gelatin is great if you need to thicken something cold, but gelatin is liquid when it's hot. If you reheat Jell-O, it melts. So gelatin is a different thing altogether. Almond flour and coconut flour, we already mentioned that. They're not starches, so they don't thicken. They don't, their cell walls don't burst to release starch to absorb liquid, which is the whole thickening process. That doesn't happen because they're both fats. So they don't thicken. Very gritty, grainy sauces, and also the flavor is not the same. So I highly recommend you don't waste time and money and ingredients with either of those things. Often people will say, just add cream cheese or heavy whipping cream.
Right. So I wanted to talk about thickening methods, because there are ways you can thicken things that don't involve using a thickener.
Right. So, and that's just basic physics, is if you remove the water, it will, if there's less liquid, you will by default at the end of it have a thicker, whatever it is you've got, a thicker soup, a thicker. The advantage of using a thickener is that it keeps it thick and it happens in 2 minutes, not 30 minutes.
Right.
Because you would have to, you can simmer things to reduce, typically called reduce. So you can simmer things for, 20, 30 minutes to reduce it by half. That half will be thicker than when you started, but you could get the same result by using konjac to thicken it.
And apparently this Thanksgiving has really weighed heavily on my mind, because in the instance of things like a gravy, you just cannot simmer chicken broth or turkey broth enough to make it the thickness of gravy.
No, you can't.
Never get there.
Right. So people often say that the cream cheese and heavy whipping cream are thickeners. They are excellent for adding flavor and creaminess, but they don't actually thicken it. Unless it's by virtue of the fact that cream cheese is thicker. So if you add a thick thing to a thin thing, overall it's thicker, but it doesn't actually thicken it. With cream, if you then simmer it for a period of time to drive off some of the water, your dish will become thicker. And with cream cheese, because it's super thick, it will make dishes seem thicker, but it doesn't actually thicken anything, if that makes sense.
Right. So it's not creating a chemical process by which the liquid becomes thicker.
Right. And cream cheese may be enough to make your dish the thickness that you want it, but you're gonna have to use a lot to make it significantly thicker, and that might throw off the balance of other ingredients and the flavor. So if you've got something that's too thin, you're thinking, oh, what can I add? And you throw in, 4 ounces or 8 ounces of cream cheese, you could materially affect the flavor and then the balance of the other ingredients.
Right, it's going to taste mostly like cream cheese at that point. And if that's your goal, that's fine. But,
absolutely.
Yeah.
So yes, you'll see recipes that use, but those recipes are developed around the fact that you're using 4 ounces of cream cheese. What we're talking about here is if you see a non-keto recipe and you get to the point where you're going, oh, it's not thick enough, I need to thicken it. Oh, I'll add cream cheese. That's where we're saying you might run into a bit of a fail if you do that. Whereas if you're using a recipe that is built around cream cheese being the thickener, then it'll probably be fine.
Right.
Did that make sense?
I think so.
Okay, good.
I hope so. Very little is making sense to me today. Fabulous. Or very little of what is coming out of my mouth is, which is a great day to podcast. The thing I was thinking about though is because I'm even sensitive to too much konjac. Like if I am not really light-handed with it, I still feel like it's a little slimy. Like if I overdo the konjac, I still don't love the texture as much. So in my cooking career, I do everything I can to minimize added thickeners and maximize the effect of cooking time, just getting as much water out of whatever I'm making as possible. Like this happened the other day. I actually had a video about it that went fairly popular. I think it's my most popular video on Facebook.
Your mashed potato video.
My mashed potato video, which is actually mashed cauliflower video.
Yes,
but it looked so much like mashed potatoes that I kept trying to say mashed potatoes. And anyway, apparently this is an ongoing problem with me and words. So podcast, perfect career. So basically a lot of people say cauliflower mash is a little thin, right? And so my cauliflower recipe was always cauliflower, butter, and cream cheese. Now, in that instance, what happens, because the cream cheeses and the butter are both naturally thicker at cooler temperatures, when you add those things to a hot dish, that then slightly cools, right? Because the temperature you want to eat something at is not the temperature you want to cook something at, because you'll burn your mouth. In case I had to explain that. But so as it sits for a little bit, it will get much thicker because those solids become semi-solid again. Or I guess they're still solid, but they'll become, cooler. As they cool, they become increasingly thick. But still, cauliflower mash is much thinner than most people experience potatoes, because they're much lower in starch, and starch has a structural element.
And potatoes do have a texture, mashed potatoes. Right. Even the creamiest, smoothest mashed potatoes still have
heft
something. Yes.
Yeah. And so I was thinking about this, and so long story for no particular reason, but there's a way that I use when I make things with pumpkin. Like if I use canned pumpkin, I actually cook the canned pumpkin first to evaporate out some of the water, so it's much more concentrated. And it just suddenly occurred to me, why didn't I do this with cauliflower mash? And so I put my blended cauliflower, I hadn't added cream cheese to it. I put my blended cauliflower in a pot. So it was a cauliflower puree in a pot, and cooked it, being careful not to let it burn, scraping with a spatula so that it was constantly scraping off the bottom. And it got super condensed because I let that water steam out that was keeping it that thinner consistency. And gosh darn, that consistency was like mashed potatoes. It was crazy. And so just kind of was a reminder that some patience in the kitchen when you're trying to thicken a sauce is sometimes one of the best things you can do. Additionally, I like to use egg yolks, butter, cream, sort of what I would consider natural foods. Konjac is a natural food, but just like naturally part of a recipe. Mm-hmm. And having just an understanding of how these different elements interact when you cook with them. Like I made a pie once with a chocolate filling. Well, I'm all over pie. And the first time I made it, I was like, I want this to be more like pudding, so I'll add some konjac. And I was like, there's something wrong with this texture of this pie. And then the next time...
It's a cold pie.
Cold pie.
Yeah, I wouldn't use konjac for a cold pie.
Yeah, well, thanks for telling me now. But I was like, I could make this, I could do this differently. I added one more egg yolk, and, and I just let the pudding mix, like the mix that goes in the pie, cook longer, so more water evaporated out. And then the texture was perfect. So the answer isn't always, what do I add, or what do I, what potion or powder can I add to this to make it right? It might be like, what's the elemental cooking technique that will get me closer to the effect I want?
Yep, absolutely. And one thing, if you're deciding to reduce your sauce, stew, gravy, whatever, by evaporating water, one, as Kim mentioned with her magical cauliflower mash, you have to keep it moving, otherwise it's just going to stick and be horrible. But also make sure there's no lid on your pan.
Oh yeah.
If you have the lid on, all that's going to happen is the steam that's being driven off is going to hit the lid, is going to condense, and the water's going to drip back into the pan. So you're actually just
circulating.
You're recirculating the water that you're trying to evict.
Right.
So
yes.
If you're trying to reduce something, make sure that the steam can all escape, because that's your water evaporating off of your hot thing. But make sure that you're stirring constantly, otherwise it'll catch and burn.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or just make a really, really sticky mess on the bottom of your pan.
Yeah, I was having to be very attentive to the cauliflower mash, but I also have a tendency not to turn my burners down enough.
Yeah, and you talked about egg yolks and an egg custard. It's the egg yolks that thicken. So egg yolks absolutely are a great way to thicken things. You do need quite a lot. And also it takes quite a long time. It takes about 10 to 12 minutes to make an egg custard thick. It takes an awful lot to make them super thick. And you do have to stir it the entire time. So there's absolutely ways that you can get your end result without using konjac or guar. But you have to weigh up your skill level, how much time you want to spend in the kitchen, all of those other things as well. I've never had konjac be slimy. So I would suggest that if you have something that is slimy with konjac, you've added a bit too much. And as Kim mentioned at the start, super important with konjac is that once you've added it, you just have to just stir and do social media for a couple of minutes, because it takes that long to thicken, which is a good thing because it means you're successful. You don't throw it in and get this gloopy mess. But it does take a couple of minutes to thicken to its full potential. A starting point for konjac is half a teaspoon per cup of liquid.
Right. And then one thing to reiterate is any substance as it cools that contains things that are more solid at cold temperatures, like coconut oil, butter, cream cheese, all these things are if you can melt them into basically a liquid, but when they're cold, they're solid. If your dish contains any of those things, as it cools from cooking temperature to eating temperature, it will become slightly thicker. So sometimes you'll be taking something off the burner, like, making a gravy, and thinking, oh, it's not quite thick enough. Well, it's going to drop in temperature like 50% when you serve it. So it's not to go to the hospital. And at that point, it's going to be even thicker than it was when it was flaming hot.
Right. So you just need to bear in mind, and as I say, if you're using great recipes like, that Kim and I produce, you don't need to worry. You don't need to think about anything. You just follow the recipe, but you measure exactly and you follow the directions and you'll have a great result. If you're trying to, what this podcast is really about is when you're trying to convert a non-keto recipe yourself into a keto one. This is really the purpose of this podcast. If you start with a good keto recipe, you shouldn't have any problems. Right.
But I think it's important for people to know how the ingredients work.
Absolutely.
And what they're doing in their food, so that
yep.
If you do start to create your own recipes or, tinker, then you know which direction to head in.
Yep. So you just really, is the first questions I would ask is the end result supposed to be cold or hot? And kind of then go, okay, if it's hot, then I'm going down this road. And if it's cold, then I'm going down this road. As Kim says, that there's certain foods that naturally thicken when they get cold, and then there's others that don't. And so that's the first question I would ask when I'm dreaming up new things is the end result, i.e. when I am serving it, is it going to be hot or cold? And then I would go down whichever thickener path is most appropriate for the way you want it when you're eating it.
Got it. Okay. Well, I feel like we have covered the thickener sphere pretty well.
I really hope that's helpful to people, because I get emails and messages all the time saying with thickener woes, right. Because there's a lot. If there's one thing that the keto cooking world is misinformed about, one of them is thickeners and the other is sweeteners. Those are the top two headaches for most people. So I hope this has helped you all understand what to use for what, and will end up with more delicious food that keeps you on the keto train.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you guys for joining us. And I promise to get more sleep next week. And we will talk more soon. If you have a topic that you want to hear us discuss, please let us know. You can go to ketolifesupport.com. There's a link to a Facebook group where you can leave a message, ask a question. You can also leave us a 5-star review. We will be checking all 5-star reviews. I'm stealing this from David Chang. We will be checking all 5-star reviews for questions. So if you ask one there, we can check it out. But the Facebook group is pretty easy to use, so you can look there too.
And if you're not into trying to switch things non-keto to keto things, both Kim and I on our respective websites have a plethora of awesome recipes that work and a bunch of cookbooks between us too.
It's true. CarrieBrown.com, KimHowerton.com. Pretty
How
simple.
easy is that?
All right, guys. We will talk to you soon. Have a good week.
Take care.
Bye. Thank you so much for joining us on Keto Life Support. If you'd like more, you can join our friendly Facebook group, Keto Life Support. Can't find it? Go to ketolifesupport.com. If you ever want to suggest a topic for discussion, that would be the place to do it. We'd really, really appreciate it if you would go to your podcast app and subscribe, because that's awesome. And what would be super awesome is if you'd be so kind as to write a review for us. Though we would love it if that review was awesome, just writing a review is all we ask. So have a fabulous keto week, and we'll see you next time.